So this is part two of our lecture on writing essay responses in exams. The UNC, University of North Carolina Writing Center, has developed a good list, and this appears on a number of websites, of the verbs that you need to think about as you write essay responses. And so again, the common ones: define, illustrate, summarize, compare and contrast, or simply compare, or simply contrast, apply, relate, synthesize, justify, argue, and evaluate. And again, what you'll notice is that these, in a sense, often work through higher orders of thinking. So definitions: to define something, to illustrate is to provide examples, to summarize is to identify the key components, compare in terms of similarities, contrast in terms of differences, apply a concept, relate, find a connection, synthesize, bring together, justify and argue are making a stance. Either justify is typically a predefined stance, or argue is one that you choose, and then to evaluate. Now what I want to do is to think about these in terms of how do you make a strategy. So let's start with a very basic idea. You've been asked an essay question, and many times I've seen students that sit down and in some respects they are panicking. They think they don't know anything. And what I would encourage you to do is, at the very beginning of every essay exam, first, if you have to choose questions, choose your questions. Look at them carefully and think about those ones that seem to be most comfortable to you. If that's the case, once you identify the questions that you think you're going to write on, begin by writing down a list of what you know. Okay? Don't worry about what you don't know. In fact, if you can think of things that you don't know, you in fact have some context. So again, quickly jot down the ideas that you do know, the terms that come to mind when you're thinking about the subject or thesis of each question. Then the next step is, for each of these, begin by writing that thesis sentence, your response to the question. Think about the thesis of the question and then turn that into a thesis statement. In the same way, follow that with a cursory outline. In other words, get down on paper where you think you're going to go in that question. Don't start writing first. Get an idea of where you need to go, look at your outline, and compare it to the question. Does your outline identify all of the key concepts that you have to cover? Look at the terms in the question. Make sure that each term that is stated in the question is part of your response. Are you addressing each aspect of it? On the next part, I want to simply go through some examples, and we'll look at how this might be approached. So the definition question. This is a very standard type of question. And so, for example, the one that I provided you with is, define anthropogenic climate change. Well, first, let's take this apart in terms of its thesis and then its subordinate questions. So the thesis is, in fact, anthropogenic climate change is a thing, and the instructor wants you to define it. So let's break it apart. Well, there's climate change. So we have what in fact is climate, how might it change, and what aspects of that can be defined as anthropogenic. So again, in your head or on paper, you need to define those key groups of questions. In other words, what does it mean when we say anthropogenic? What does it mean when we say climate change? In a definition question, the first part of it has to be a series of sentences that clearly define the term. Now, make sure that when you define a term, you are not simply restating the word in a slightly different fashion. To simply say human climate change is insufficient in this case. The definition has to also then be supported within typically some type of broad grouping or context. In other words, you'll improve your definition by support. And this is true of any paragraph. We start with a thesis, then we move to supporting sentences. Support the definition. Anthropogenic climate change is a type of climate change that is occurring. It is similar to other aspects of climate change, but it is caused by human beings. In a like manner, we might say that this falls into a broad category of human-induced environmental change, or even degradation. Differentiate the term. Oftentimes in a definition, even though we're asking for a definition, by using differentiation, in other words, anthropogenic climate change, differs from other long-term geologic climate change on certain classification concepts or certain characteristics. In other words, its rate in the case of anthropogenic climate change. It's the rate of change more than the magnitude of change. It is associated with human carbon emissions. Now, the other point here is typically with a definition question, then you're going to want to move to examples. Now, I also want you to think about this in terms of a general paragraph. We've now started with a thesis, supporting sentences, detail, and an example. That's a very good paragraph form. And we can move through this question fairly easily that way. Now, the compare and contrast question. Please note that compare and contrast are two oppositional terms. Compare is to ask for the similarities or identify the similarities in two or more concepts. Contrast is just the opposite. It is to find the differences, what makes them different. So again, the strategy for this is you start with a thesis, and that is typically the commonalities. Begin with the commonalities. So you'll notice here, define the general area that both terms fall within. Now, here we've asked for content areas of geography and geology. So we need to define content areas, and then we need to say, well, okay, what is the commonality? For example, geography and geology are scientific disciplines that study aspects of Earth, or geography and geology are traditional academic disciplines that have been taught at the university level. These are two fundamentally different theses, but in fact, they would allow us to move forward. Next, again, we're going from our very broad thesis to a more detailed supporting statement. Both geography and geology study phenomena that occur at or near Earth's surface. Okay. So once you've done that, then you can begin to move into the discriminatory or exclusionary differences. Differences should be identified in terms of those things that break things apart. What makes geography not geology, or vice versa. And again, finally, like the last, our definition, provide examples of each. That example of each ties everything together. Once you're done with that, then again, go back to your thesis and make sure that you've covered the ideas. Again, our paragraph here starts with a thesis, supporting or subordinate ideas, details, and examples. Inverted pyramid.